So the Fisher, the Connecticut stealth hunter, as all you know, I'm a master wildlife conservationist with the Deep, and it's a volunteer activity I take very seriously and spend a lot of time trying to educate people about the environment and our awesome flora and fauna and how what we can do to protect it. So anyway, the Fisher, probably an animal that most of you have not seen. We call it the stealth hunter because it does hunt pretty much exclusively at night. Um, what's a fisher, you say? I thought it was a fisher cat. I spent a lot of my time trying to dispel this and tell people, no, it's not a cat, it's a weasel. Um, Fisher cat, hold on a second. Fisher cat is a moniker that, for some unbeknownst reason, although there are theories, has been attached to the fisher, which is, as I said, a member of the weasel family. Perhaps it's because most folks blame the loss of their cats on the fisher, which is a ferocious stealth hunter. It is the main consumer of porcupines in the Northeast. Out west, mountain lions will prey on porkies as well as wolves. Occasionally, a bobcat will prey on a fisher, but they don't tend to run into each other that often. Fisher is the preferred name. A lot of states have given up trying to have people stop calling it Fisher cat. So when you have the fact sheet on the Fisher in, say, New Hampshire and I think Vermont, they'll say Fisher, also known as Fisher cat. So do they eat the domestic cats? Sure, as do foxes, coyotes, owls, bobcats, and more likely a local SUV. It's the nature of a house cat injured on a highway or sick to seek a hiding place to die, but you can bet a Fisher cat will be blamed for its disappearance. Instances of fishers preying on cats and small dogs have been reported often, but a bunch of studies, one in suburban New York, found no cat remains in 24 scat or stomach samples of Fisher. You say, well, that's a low number. Well, they don't get that many Fisher, hit by cars or found dead. Massachusetts did a similar sample of 226 stomachs, found no cat at all. A larger study over a few years was done in New Hampshire by New Hampshire Fish and Game. Of 1,000 fishers, they found cat hair in one stomach. So most of the stomach contents contained squirrel, rabbits, other small prey, but only one domestic cat. But the fisher, whose population is very healthy in New England and mostly in our state, it's in northwest Connecticut, pockets of eastern and northeastern Connecticut. It might be throughout the state, but not in large numbers at all. But it is healthy. But they are oftentimes blamed for our pets' disappearances. This is one reason, not just the fisher, but for other animals. We ask pet owners to not let their cats roam outside, not only because of the inherent dangers to them, but they also kill tons of songbirds, millions of songbirds a year. So that's not a good thing. Fishers are a member of the weasel family, Mustelidae, and it includes weasels, otters, and wolverines. We do have river otters here, but we do not have wolverines. It has the aggressive carnivorous temperament of a wolverine in a smaller body. It can climb trees like a marten. We do not have the marten in Connecticut. It is up in Maine and northern New Hampshire. A fisher will kill multiple animals at a time in a confined space, but they are, as I said, nocturnal and not easily spotted. They will move from tree to tree, kind of like a squirrel. They have a very long, slender body. They have very short legs and elongated, bushy tail. They're usually dark brown to nearly black. Their tail, their rump, and their feet are darkest in contrast to their head and shoulders, which are lighter in color, and oftentimes, as you can see in the face on the right, grizzled in appearance. Some fisher will have a white patch, not as big as the one of the pine marten over there on the left, but a little white patch. In the fisher, males are typically larger. They can be up to 18 pounds, so, significant size. They're almost twice the weight of the female, who's generally 6 to 8 pounds. The adult fishers are 24 to 30 inches long, but that does include their tail, but their tail does comprise a third of their length. So when you're trying to recognize an animal crossing the road in the dark, if you see this long tail, then that might help you recognize the fisher. You'll see some images of kind of what they look like as they move. The male and female, besides their size, they're slightly different. Males do appear darker and more grizzled in appearance. They also have a very domed forehead, whereas a female's head is a little smaller, sleeker. But it's not because their brain is smaller. I did read that compared to the male, the female fisher actually has a larger brain to body size ratio. Sorry, guys. The male's domed head, though, does reflect his large temporalis muscle, which you'll see later, a chewing muscle that attaches to the bony ridge that runs from his forehead to the back of the head. And that means he has a very super powerful bite. So again, they are medium-sized carnivores, as I said. They are, for every pound for pound, they're generally fairly ferocious. The differences, even though, as I said, you're not going to see them here, the faces are triangular on the martins and not on the fisher. The fisher's ears are wider and more rounded, kind of like bear ears, as you see that, where the martins are more pointed. Let me go back to that. You can see that. So, and again, the fisher are considerably larger and the fur is darker than the martins. Fishers live to be about 10 to 12 years of age in the wild. They don't tend to go along the roads as often as a lot of our other animals because they do stay around the trees looking for porcupines and other prey. Both sexes reach maturity their first year, and most of them mate in their second year. Fishers, as you can see, are pretty much a northern animal in more northern climates. They can be found in central and southern Canada, northern California, the Rocky Mountains, and just a little bit, and throughout New England. It's only found in North America, and it's considered to be a species of least concern, with an estimated 100,000 living across its range. Of course, again, because it is so elusive, it's hard to get a very accurate count, but that's the count that's come up with. We do have a study that's been taking place lately by a student at Central Connecticut State University, Katerina Gillis. She set up more than 240 camera traps, and she categorized them into 40 different detection units. She was on state-owned and private-owned forest land that was suitable for fishers. Her goal is to find out where the distribution of fisher are in Connecticut. Half of these cameras were set west of the Connecticut River and the other half east. She hiked about 1,800 miles to complete placement of all the cameras, return to the cameras to gather data. Her data right now on fisher distribution is not complete. It takes a long time to assimilate all that data and go through, hundreds of thousands of photos. But the data she has right now has led her to suspect fishers prefer to inhabit forests east of the Connecticut River or in northern Connecticut along the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. So far, 100% of the units in the east detected fishers, which is a very high rate, whereas 35% of the western units detected fisher. And, we who live in Northwest Connecticut like to say we have more of all the animals, but this study is proving that east of the river, there's a little more. From 2000 to 2004, state sightings of vehicle kill reports documented 170 four fishers from 71 towns. In 2017, there were 13 fisher sightings, which that dropped down. Doesn't mean there were less fisher, they just weren't hit on the road. In 2019, there were 47 reports, and 2020 had a small uptick of 90. So according to recently retired biologist Paul Rigo, the sightings were most prominent in the period between 2002 and 2004, but they have declined since. But we still say they're a species of least concern here in Connecticut. Again, vehicle kills also are an important but sad way for us to help count species. So what Gillis did say was an important quote. She said in her study, it would determine future protection efforts and hunting regulations of the fisher. Um, and she says the main importance of fisher is the fact that they are a native species here in Connecticut, and it's good to maintain our native species within the state, unlike red fox and coyote, which are not and are direct competitors. So here's a little fun. I always like to do this. The fisher, which is known now as Martes pinnati in Latin, is also known as we discussed, the fisher cat, the pecan, the oatjoke, the oatshillick, and historically as the weejack by early European settlers. It's a member of the weasel family. The variety of the names of it is attributed to it. It hints at its wide northern distribution. We think that the common name fisher is likely have derived from early European settlers in their acknowledgement of the animal's kind of superficial resemblance to what they call a European polecat. We know, like where I grew up in Texas, we call polecat skunks. Well, their polecat was a dark animal that looked very similar to the fisher. And it was sometimes referred to as fichet, Fichet, or Fitche. So that may be how the name got turned into fisher cat. In 1794, Samuel Williams described the fisher in his publication, The Natural and Civil History of Vermont, as a fierce and ravenous animal of great activity and strength. He went on to say that the fisher could not be tamed or made to associate with our common cats. So again, when things are written like this, people take that extra leap, kind of they do with the bear tagging system. One tag, they were in trouble. Two, they were in trouble the second time. Third time, they're out, which is totally not true. So again, there are some areas of the country and in Canada where they call it the pecan, Pekan. Although the latter of these may be true, this small forest-dwelling carnivore is often characterized as very savage. But it has been valued as a fur source from the beginnings of colonial times, and only more recent times that its predatory nature has become an appreciated part of our healthy functioning ecosystems. I always have to say to people, circle of life, you hate seeing like, an animal getting a squirrel and, tootling along with it or whatever, but all of these different species do play an important part in our ecosystem. In some of my talks, you've seen the historic range of the fisher again was from Canada down into this part of our country, but overtrapping, fear of predation because it was a carnivore, extensive deforestation, which left us with, less than 50% forest in the mid 1800s, and making way for agriculture. The fisher kind of disappeared from Connecticut before the 20th century. Though these colonists right now are going against other animals with quite ferocious attacks. There's no fisher in here, but it's similar to their attitude towards any kind of animal they felt was a threat or they could use their fur to make money. The attractiveness and value of fisher pelts for the fur trade, it did contribute to a decline in the fisher's range and numbers, not so much so as the beaver, but it did knock the numbers down significantly. Together with the felling of the forest for farming and then the expansion of housing, it did speed up their decline. But thanks to a gradual shift of human populations from rural farmland to cities, our forests started to grow back. And together with monitored trapping seasons and limits, the fisher has now reoccupied its original range and their numbers do continue to grow. Just if you're curious, today fisher pelts range from $50 to $100, but trapping is regulated in most New England states, including Connecticut. A friend of mine in Maine had this family of fisher that were just hanging out in her backyard for the summer a few years ago. So she was kind enough to let me use her photos. Her name is Carol Cookingham Belanger. She's not a professional photographer, but She gets really great shots, and I'm always grateful to anybody who lets me use photos of something I may not have a lot of photos of myself. So like any other animal, fishers need the four basic habitat requirements, which is true of us: food, water, shelter, and space. Uh, they live in a variety of young and old forest types along edges of woodlands and marshlands because they can catch their favorite rabbits and little critters there. They will range over 7 to 10 miles. They will travel day or night, though they typically move more in the nighttime. But they do prefer large areas of conifer forest, particularly old timber stands, because there's a lot of these little critters that they like to hunt. They do avoid open areas, and that does contribute to their elusiveness and rarely seen reputations. This is an area that they would like very much, old pine forest. They can find denning areas very easily there with a lot of overturned trees and just up in the boughs, hollowed out sections and stumps, fallen logs and tree trunks. As you hike in Connecticut and go by a lot of fallen logs with holes in them, there you can bet there's some kind of some type of creature that does go in there and stays. Again, they like low to mid elevation environments. And they like large trees for denning and finding food, such as squirrels. They might even take a squirrel right out of a tree and take it right to its den. It will not occupy forests with less than 50% canopy cover. So they do they don't fly, but they jump from tree to tree and move along the trees as they hunt. So again, this is a tree cavity. They depend heavily on them for shelter and for raising their young. I'll eat nuts and things that go nuts over nuts. They are omnivorous carnivores, which means they don't just eat solely meat. They'll eat insects, they'll eat plants, berries, fruits, whatever is available, but preferentially they like mammals. Squirrels, rabbits, mice, voles, carrion, porcupines, even birds and frogs. They also will consume acorns, which a lot of animals do, and they were all missing them this past year because it was a very bad mast year, not a lot of acorns around. Again, it is a very effective hunter, and even though it is an omnivore, it is primarily a carnivore. It's solitary. It's limited as to the size of its prey. It does target those smaller animals. It will dine on carrion or dead stuff, such as deer carcasses, but it also, again, will eat berries, mushrooms, and other plants. But again, it's a proficient predator, and that's how it gets most of its food. It is, as I said, one of the very few animals that will target the porcupine, whose long, ominous needle-like quills are generally enough to ward off even most ferocious attackers. We'll discuss how they do hunt the porcupine later. It's one of the very few mammals in our hemisphere, or actually in North America, which is faster in the trees than on the forest floor. It can chase fleet prey up to 80 feet above the ground. With their combination of speed, agility, and power, many prey species are on the menu. And again, while its main species are squirrels and some rabbits, it can run down the trees. Its feet will reverse, so it can go down the tree, not face first. So rodents, shrews, ruffed grouse, snowshoe hare, possums, striped skunks, anything is fair game for the fisher, and they are very swift and can take it very swift. How could a creature possibly take a porcupine and survive? We have found roadkill bobcats that have porcupine quills embedded in their cheeks. A lot of animals won't go after something that they know hurts them because there's so many other things they can feed on in most cases. But the fisher, just when we think we know these relentless carnivores, they surprise us as far as their food. If prey is less abundant than ripening fruit, you might see them in an apple tree eating apples or consuming berries. They'll switch gears to this omnivorous life. But with that reputation as a tough as nails fighter, and they have been known to go head to head with bobcats, Canada lynx, it's not only tough, but also possesses a veritable superpower, which has caught the attention of medical science. It's one of the few mammal species with a remarkably low incidence of disease. It's this obscure yet fascinating attribute about them that has made it a subject of much study. Here's another view of my friend's Fisher. That's the adult. Okay, prickly prey. We do have more of our porcupines in Connecticut or in the northwest corner. The Fisher, as I said, is one of the few animals that will prey on porcupine. It's kind of an interesting way. When a porcupine feels threatened, they have 30,000 quills. They will start turning in circles, and then when they start really feeling threatened, they'll raise their quills. They cannot throw them, as Disney makes you believe, but the quills have a little barb on them. If they stick to somebody, if you've ever had a dog, the quills will then go out and embed themselves in whatever it has touched. Well, the Fisher generally will get the porcupine on the ground, and it will circle the porcupine. And the porcupine doesn't have quills on its stomach and has very few on its face. So the Fisher will circle the porcupine, and each time it comes to the face of the porcupine, it'll bite it. And it goes round and round, bite, round and round, bite, and just keeps doing that until the porcupine is so weakened, it kind of falls, and then the Fisher will push it over and eat it from the belly. So if you see a porcupine, you can pretty much tell whether it was roadkill or eaten by a Fisher. If the porcupine does seek refuge in the tree, the Fisher will dash up the tree to try to force it back onto the ground because it's easier to hunt for it there. So pretty brutal way to catch. And generally, I don't know if I did fearsome foursome. I think I did for you, but those 30,000 quills of the porcupine are made out of keratin like our fingernails, but they are hollow. So it helps a porcupine, if they have to escape, they can go in the water and it helps them float. So that's a pretty cool thing about the porcupines. I used to love Mark Trail when I was a kid in the comics. I don't know if y'all ever saw it, but I took these out of one. This is a fairly recent, well, not recent, but 2010. Fishers are unequaled in keeping the tree-damaging porcupine under control. Not many meat eaters will try to make a meal of a porcupine, but the Fisher has no problem with the porky. So I couldn't resist. That's a great drawing of a Fisher over on the right, and I couldn't resist that. Stories are told that the Fisher does attack and kill the porcupines by just flipping them over and eating on their stomach, but it is that repeated bite to the face as it circles it over and over that wounds the porcupine enough that it can't resist. Again, they will attack bobcat and lynx. Not sure why. Maybe they're just kind of nasty individuals and just want to prove that they can. But it's hard to say what is in an animal's mind. So here's some of the porcupines I've taken photos of through the years. They do have those orange teeth like beavers because they will eat the cambion off the trees. A lot of times in the spring, they'll be on your different little trees, you know, trying to get some food. Again, you can see this Fisher got a few quills in it, so so they're not immune to that. Again, these are predators formerly found in Connecticut during colonial days. They were hunted out before the 1800s, the 1700s were gone. So again, they're not here to eat them, but they will eat them out there. A Fisher's foot's pretty distinguishable. It has 5 digits. The front foot's palm pad is kind of C-shaped, as you see there, curving away from the toes. The heel pad shows in the track impression of the front foot. Sometimes this is called a direct register. A lot of animals, when they walk along, their hind foot will land where their front foot was, making it even harder to sometimes figure out what animals went there. The claw marks are visible on the Fisher. They are not visible on bobcats, even though people like to say that. But watch your kitty out in the sand or in her kitty litter, their tracks will, you know, their claws do not show. Fishers do hunt by zigzagging through areas of thick regenerating forest vegetation. So depending on the substrate, which is like the snow or the mud or the sand, their tracks can look a little different. I've been studying tracking for a long time, and I have to say I'm not very good at it because it's a lot of minutia and it's very difficult, but it's interesting to really try to figure it out. I mean, there are a lot of animals I recognize, but sometimes I don't. This friend of mine, Janet Pesatoro, she's a professor and a PhD wildlife biologist her whole life. She wrote this book, Camera Trapping Guide. And camera trapping is when somebody uses a real camera, you know, and has it in armor rather than a game cam. And they take just remarkable photos of animals. And she's been very generous with me in letting me use some of her photos. I recommend the book, even if you don't want to do camera trapping. She has field guides in there to our most frequent animals in New England. So it's very good. I don't get a kickback, but I am appreciative that she lets me use this her photo. So that's a fisher bounding through the snow, as you can see there. Here's a typical profile of a fisher. This one's just walking along, and sometimes when they're moving fast, they'll have a little hump in the middle of their back. But as you see, it's not really an animal we see a lot. If you saw an otter, you know, they kind of have a dark furry body, but they're much more elongated with a skinny tail. To keep warm during cold spells, they do seek shelter in temporary dens, or they'll even burrow under the snow. Again, you can easily see any animal's tracks in snow cover. I love to go out right after snow. But deep snows do limit the mobility of fisher. A lot of smaller animals will try to go in forests, you know, underneath trees where the snow tends to melt quicker, and also they'll go across logs or rock walls. You can sometimes see tracks on there. Again, here's another great photo by my friend Carol. Just fabulous photo of a fisher that, you know, it'd be hard for any of us to get here in Connecticut, even though we do have them. Again, you can see the little bare ears, and there now you can see the kind of little hump on the back there. So I'm going to show you this video by a friend of mine, George Graham in Massachusetts. There's a number of animals that come through here, and most animals, when they move along in the forest, they are doing scent marking. They'll use urine or musk that's in their anal glands. Bears will rub on trees, and everybody's like, oh, isn't that cute? He's scratching his back. Well, in most degrees, they are marking the tree, but sometimes they might be trying to get ticks off of them because they got a lot of ticks, but mostly they are marking. So you'll see a variety of animals in here, which is kind of interesting, but you'll also see the fisher is like the river otter, very intent on leaving its scent all over the place. And oftentimes I wonder if its scent doesn't even recognize its own scent. So look at the time marks. These are pretty interesting. And I'm sorry, this is my friend up in Canada that she doesn't really want her name used, but she's great at camera tracking. So you'll see that. The coyotes don't like the cameras at all. They'll just shy away really quick. There's the fisher. And they like to mark posts that are sticking up like this, you know, from old dead trees. He just rubs all over there, getting his scent and scent from his rear. Here he comes back. This is very, very typical fisher behavior. There's two bobcats, a male on the right and a female on the left. You can see the difference in their sizes. Here's a fisher again, you know, another day. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if it knows it's him or. You can see they've got very sleek coats, you know, you can see why they were very valued as furs. Now watch the coyote, he's always weary because he's always hard pressed. So they're not going to hang around much where they sense their sense of smell is very acute. You can see that eye shine of the fisher. We talked about eye shine on some animals. So to me, that's pretty interesting video. So here again, here's some of the tracks in the snow. The front track usually measures 2¼ to 4 inches in width. It does have 5 clawed toes. It does have some cushioning fur, as you can see. The innermost toe often doesn't register. You can see the pads there, so pretty interesting. The hind tracks are smaller, about 2 to 3 inches in width. So if they did, here they didn't do the direct register, so they didn't step right on each other. So you can see very clearly those tracks. Again, here they are on a log. So you can see in the front there, they did have a direct register. They hind foot on the front foot, but always look on logs when you're out hiking in the snow. Here's the fisher just kind of going around, looking for something. It doesn't look like they caught it, but they are said to walk, trot, lope, and gallop, sort of like a horse. I've seen lopes and walks in track patterns, although I hadn't seen the fisher that did it. I don't think I've ever seen a fisher trot pattern, and maybe not a gallop, which is on the right there. Usually in snow of just a few inches deep, they do a 2x2 lope, as you can kind of see there on the left. And their hind foot does superimpose over the front. This saves energy for them. If they're in a shallower substrate, sand, or not very much snow, they will go 3x4 rotary lope, as you can kind of see on the second one. So very interesting. So when you're tracking, you have to know all of these things. It's not easy, but as you can see, mud is one of also a very good substrate, because those tracks will stay there pretty good unless somebody walks on them or if there's rain or something. Whereas snow, if the wind blows snow and changes the tracks a little bit. Stride is important when you're measuring and trying to figure out animals, like how many inches between the prints, and theirs is about 20 to 21 inches. Scat is also a way to recognize what animal went there. Their scat is very similar to mink. Mink is much smaller, so theirs would be much smaller. The mink scat, though, would have very fine hairs because of their diet of small rodents, and is very tightly compacted, whereas fisher kills larger animals, which would have coarser hair, not type. So, as I said, a lot of this is hard to determine, but if you study it, sometimes you can figure it out. They have regular areas in which they travel, which is true of owls. Owls hunt in certain areas. So at night, if they're swooping down to grab a rabbit, they go, oh, that glacial erratic's there. I got to move, or I'm going to hit it. So a lot of animals like osprey, eagles, they tend to fish in kind of the same area, and they know what's there. It's true also of fisher and some other animals. They travel to and from their hunting grounds. Within these areas, you can often spot a scent post. You can see the fur there on that twig down below that branch. So scent posts are often, as I said, small pointy stumps of small trees. They'll also drag their body over the snow and land, even ice, leaving their scents. So they do have very powerful jaws, like most mammal carnivores. They have large, sharp canine teeth, as you can see in the front. That's used for stabbing and holding prey. Their molars there are used for shearing and crushing, kind of gross sounding, but they're necessary. Those big ones towards the back are carnassial molars. They're most specialized, and they are adapted for cutting flesh with scissor-like movements. They have 38 teeth. So again, they use these sharp, strong teeth, and they're adapted for hunting and eating their prey quickly and precisely. There's a fisher's skull in its actual size. You can see the man's hand. So again, fisher use their teeth for capturing, killing, and consuming prey. Those sharp canine teeth pretty much can kill the prey. And then they use those molars to cut it, grind it, and eat it. They'll even crush and grind bones. So if threatened, the fisher will use its teeth to defend itself and bite its attacker. So it's very good in defending itself. So mating. In Connecticut, fishers have their young in March and April. They have 2 to 4 kits. They have closed eyes, which is true of a lot of young animals. Only the female cares for the young. The kits do develop rapidly and are weaned in 4 months. Fishers are polygynous, which means the males seek out multiple females. They breed in April. They do have that interesting reproductive strategy that black bears and a few other animals had, called delayed implantation. Here's a chart. The fertilized egg remains dormant after they mate for 10 to 11 months. And at the end of February, the fertilized egg will implant in the uterine wall and development begins with a gestation period of about 30 days. It will not implant if there's not enough nutrients in the fissure, if there hasn't been enough food. The body determines whether or not the female can support a young. So Fisher always sometimes uses hollowed out trees or other protected areas for their dens. When the young are not only blind when they're born, their eyes and ears are sealed shut. They nurse for about 10 weeks, and then they'll switch to solid food, which the mother will bring in. But then they get restless and they start throwing debris around. They're like your worst nightmare kids. So the mother finally pushes them out because they're fussing and fighting and throwing junk around. But they will remain with her until just before she gives birth the next time. So then they'll disperse and seek their own territories. In summer, when food is more plentiful, territories need to be smaller, tend to be smaller, about 3 square miles, but in the winter, they'll expand to about 5. The males and females will overlap in their territories. Here's some young fisher. As you can see, that one on the top does have that white patch. Again, some of them will have that. Here's my friend Carol's young fisher in her yard. You get to watch them grow up. She lives very remote, so there they are with the mother in the background. So fisher history in Connecticut. A team of veterinarians, biologists worked together to administer distemper vaccines right there. But again, in the 19th century, fishers became scarce and soon were extirpated, which means that they exist somewhere else, were no longer here. So as reforestation began, the biologists recognized that maybe we need fisher again. They were a native animal. So they never recolonized, so maybe we had to help them. So they did naturally enter into Massachusetts on the eastern portion. So we had a project to reintroduce this native mammal to northwestern Connecticut in 1988. There were funds used by turkeys that we trapped and sold to Maine to release up there. Oftentimes different states will do this for different animal species. And it's called, in what is termed a soft release. These fisher were penned and fed at the release site for a couple of weeks prior to their release. So here they were. Here's an immobilized fisher in a holding box prior to them examining it before they put it out. So here's a few historic photos. So that is Paul Rigo, who we just lost to retirement. He's having a great time, but he was with the agency for almost 40 years, so a very valuable one of our fur bearer biologists. So there'll be others to follow, some younger people that he trained. Here he is taking a blood sample to check for disease. As I said, they're fairly disease resistant. Here's at Session Woods in Burlington, which is a great place to visit. They've got all kinds of stuff there, all kinds of trails, all kinds of a museum. Not too far going up Route 8. So prior to transport, they put the fisher here. So they kind of got the environment. Then the holding pens were loaded onto a truck for transport. It's fun to see the old trucks in this. The pens were then taken to a remote location in the northwestern part of the state. They then released the fisher. As you see, this fisher was very anxious to go. It wasn't going to hang around. When we did our bobcat study and trapped some bobcat and collared them, when it was time to release them, some of them would go pretty quick, but some of them would kind of just sit there for a minute deciding what's going on, So one fisher who was originally released in March of 1990 was discovered nearly 5 years after her release. She had a collar, pretty remarkable. So they had pulled a tooth prior to releasing her when she was 3 years old at the time, where she was captured in New Hampshire. Then the first year she did not raise a litter. Her radio collar, though, revealed her movements throughout the state. In March, she was in Cornwall. In April, she was 10 miles south in Washington, and then back to Cornwall. and her long, frequent travel made tracking challenging. 2 weeks later, she found 20 miles to the east in Barkhamsted, and in early May, she was in Winstead. Weeks later, her signal was lost, and an airplane was used in June to capture her signal once again back into Washington. So finally, in early autumn, her movements subsided into a home range centered in Roxbury, going more down toward Jaw. And in the spring of 1991, she was tracked to her den tree using a portable antenna and receiver. They heard cries of young Fisher in the cavity, and 3 Fisher kits were seen. After this interaction in 1996, her collar died and she was later found deceased. So this was valuable. The collar did help them track and learn about the movement of a Fisher, and this particular female did move quite a bit. Again, these radio collars were used in Fisher research projects. Through radio tracking and snow tracking, the biologists found that the Fishers did remain in northwestern Connecticut at that time. And now, as I told you, they have moved. But back then, they had high survival rates, and they did successfully reproduce, so it was a really good reintroduction. So that's one of the radio collars, which is fixed with telemetry device so that they can use this wand to figure out where they are. So there's the telemetry. It's not that big anymore. Now, that's kind of like holding a bald eagle on your arm, but now it's much smaller. It does require a radio transmitter and an antenna to receive signals. It typically required the user to get signals from a VHS transmitter. Now it's gone more to GPS, usually in a collar attached to the animal, as you see. The location of the transmitter on the animal is usually determined by acquiring the signals from 3 or more different locations to triangulate the location of the device. A little too mathematical for me. And now we do not use something this big, but this is the old technology. They drive along with a large antenna to try to track the signal of the collared fishes, and that allowed them to cover a larger distance than if they were on foot. It did work at the time. So you can see the traps that were used during the trapping season to get them and collar them. In 2005, we did institute a regulated trapping season for Fisher. Most northern states have regulated trapping season for Fishers. Again, the fur is relatively valuable, even though fur sales have gone down very much, significantly. So properly sized box traps are used to trap Fisher during the season. Anything that's trapped, there's all kinds of regulations on what kind of traps you can use, the size, all of that. So the annual Fisher harvest, unfortunately, we only have up to 2016, but as you can see from 2006 on the left, it declined significantly. Trapping has become less popular. So a lot of this is funded by the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Program. It was initiated by sportsmen and conservationists to provide state and wildlife agencies with funding. Hunters do pay a fee, which does go to this, that helps fund studies and research and different things to benefit wildlife. If you want to report a Fisher sighting or a vehicle killed Fisher, which is one of the animals we really appreciate, if you can get in touch with Deep. So, oops, what was it? So, hold on a second. Oh, and about those blood-curdling Fisher cat screams in the night. If you Google screams in the night, and you'll get about, I don't know, 50 videos of some guy looking out in the darkness, and he's looking at the camera, but the darkness is behind him, and you'll hear the scream, and he'll point, and he says, "That's a Fisher cat." Well, no, it's a red fox. Red fox have maybe 40 different vocalizations. Deep gets dozens and dozens of calls a month from people saying a Fisher cat screaming in the darkness, or the police oftentimes get a call that a lady's being murdered in the backyard. Fishers are silent predators. They're often pretty much quiet. They don't make much noise. If they make any noise, it's a small growl. So more than likely, the noises people hear are a red fox or even raccoons fussing with each other. There's a young fisher. You can see those claws are pretty. So just here's a few red fox sounds that people mistake for fisher. Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong thing. And again, as I said, fox, I can't get it down where the arrow is. This bar is in my way. Sorry, I gotta move it. So sometimes can sound pretty eerie. So as I said, they have all kinds of different sounds and noises. And generally 90-something% of the time, it's always a red fox. So don't let people say that's a fisher that they just heard out, or they'll probably say fisher cat, but it's not. So